The microphone's screech was the only warning I got before my world dismantled itself. Standing there, holding a crystal flute of champagne that suddenly felt like lead, I watched my son, Julian, grip the microphone stand with white-knuckled intensity. The hum of conversation from 300 guests, senators, investors, and old family friends gathered under the sprawling white tent, died instantly. Julian looked at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth I had nurtured for 32 years. They were glassy, hard, and terrifyingly distant. Beside him stood Serena, his bride of only 3 hours, looking immaculate in lace and silk, whispering something into his ear that made his jaw tighten. Then he spoke, his voice booming through the speakers and echoing off the rolling hills of the vineyard I had spent my life cultivating. "Get out, mother." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the tent. I felt 300 pairs of eyes shift from the handsome groom to me, the 62-year-old matriarch standing in her emerald velvet gown, frozen in a posture of dignified horror. I understood in that shattered second that there are sentences that function like guillotines. Once they drop, the head is severed from the body, and there is no way to reattach it. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am the owner of the Vance Estate and Vineyards in Sonoma County, California. For decades, I have been known as a woman of iron will, a widow who turned a failing grape harvest into a premier wine empire. But this is not a story about business success. This is the story of how a wedding destroyed my lineage, how a son became a stranger, and how the brutal act of being expelled from my own family saved my life. The day had begun with a deceptive perfection. The Californian sun had bathed the valley in a golden hue, the kind of light that photographers pray for. I had spent months ensuring every detail was flawless, from the importation of rare orchids to the vintage of the Cabernet served at dinner. The estate, a Victorian mansion surrounded by 400 acres of vines, had never looked more majestic. I had embroidered the napkins myself during sleepless nights, stitching the new couple's initials with gold thread, praying that my labor would somehow knit them closer to me. Julian was marrying Serena Thorne, a venture capitalist from San Francisco, with a smile that could freeze water and eyes that calculated the net worth of everything they rested upon. She had entered Julian's life 18 months prior and systematically dismantled the man he was. But tonight, I was determined to be the gracious mother-in-law. I wore the emerald gown because green was Julian's favorite color on me, or at least it used to be. When I had walked into the reception tent earlier, Serena had intercepted me near the ice sculpture. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't smile. She simply looked at my dress and then at the guests. She walked straight to Julian, pulled him aside, and I saw the transformation happen. I saw my son shrink. He walked toward me then, not with the stride of a man, but with the shuffling gait of a scolded child. He told me that Serena felt my dress was an attempt to upstage her. He said I looked too prominent. I offered to change. I offered to leave and put on a simple gray suit I had in the main house. But that wasn't enough. The mere fact of my existence, my history on this land, was the offense. And so, the public expulsion happened. I did not cry. A Vance does not cry in front of strangers. I placed the champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray, smoothed the velvet of my skirt, and turned around. I walked the long aisle between the tables, head high, listening to the soft gasps and the whispers. My heels clicked a solitary rhythm on the dance floor parquet. No one ran after me. No one grabbed my arm to stop the madness. Julian watched me go, his hand firmly held by his new wife. I reached my car, a vintage Jaguar that had belonged to my late husband, Arthur. Around my neck, resting heavy against my collarbone, was the iron key ring to the estate. It was a heavy, archaic set of keys that opened the main gates, the wine cellars, the safe, and the front door. My father had given them to me, and I was supposed to give them to Julian tonight. as a symbolic passing of the torch. I drove up the winding path to the main house, the music from the party fading into a dull throb behind me. I entered the silent foyer, the moonlight spilling across the black and white marble floors. I took off the emerald dress, folding it with trembling hands, and placed it in a box. I would never wear it again. I sat in the darkness of the library, surrounded by the scent of old paper and mahogany, and waited for the morning. I didn't sleep. I just listened to the house settling. The groans of the timber that sounded like the structure itself was mourning. The next day, the silence was absolute. I expected an apology. I expected Julian to drive up the gravel driveway, hungover and ashamed, begging for forgiveness. Instead, I received a notification on my phone. A social media post from Serena. New beginnings require clearing out the old clutter. Best night of my life. It was 3 days later when the phone finally rang. Seeing Julian's name on the screen sent a jolt of electricity through my chest. I cleared my throat, desperate to sound composed, and answered, "Mother." His voice was unrecognizable. It was flat, stripped of cadence, a corporate drone. "Can we come up to the main house? We need to have a meeting." He didn't say, "visit." He said, "meeting." I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking the same dark roast coffee I used to make for him when he was a teenager cramming for finals. Back then, it was just us. After Arthur died of a sudden heart attack 20 years ago, Julian and I had been a fortress of two. He was 12. A sensitive boy with artistic hands, who loved the vines not for the profit, but for the science. We had saved this place together. When the blight hit in the late 90s, we were on our knees in the mud, checking rootstocks. When the bank threatened foreclosure, I sold my jewelry, and Julian sold his comic book collection without me asking. We were partners. "I'm here, Julian," I said. They arrived an hour later. Julian looked polished, wearing a designer suit that seemed too tight across the shoulders. Serena was radiant in a white power suit. Her hair pulled back so severely it pulled at her temples. She carried a leather portfolio. "Coffee?" I offered, gesturing to the pot. "No, thank you, Eleanor," Serena said, bypassing the kitchen table to head straight for the formal dining room. "We have a tight schedule." We sat at the long oak table, where we had celebrated every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every milestone. Serena placed the portfolio on the table and opened it. She didn't look at the family portraits on the walls. She looked at the room dimensions. "Julian and I have been reviewing the estate's assets," she began, her tone breezy, as if discussing the weather. "The wedding really opened our eyes to the potential of this place. It's underutilized." "Underutilized?" I looked at Julian. He was staring at his hands. "We produce 40,000 cases of award-winning Cabernet a year, Julian. It's a low-margin agricultural model, Mother," Julian said, reciting words that sounded alien on his tongue. "Serena has a background in asset optimization. We've been talking about pivoting." "Pivoting to what?" Serena slid a glossy brochure across the table. It was a computer-generated rendering. My stomach churned as I looked at it. The historic vines, some of which were planted by my grandfather in 1920, were gone. In their place were glamping pods, a massive glass and steel event center, and a paved parking lot where the rose garden currently stood. "The Vance Experiential Resort," Serena announced proudly. "High-end weddings, corporate retreats, a spa facility. We stopped growing grapes, it's too risky with the climate, and we import wine to label it here. We turned the main house into the lobby and boutique hotel suites." I felt the blood drain from my face. "This is our home. This is a working farm. My husband's ashes are scattered in the north field. Sentimental value doesn't show up on a balance sheet." "Eleanor," Serena said, her voice dropping to a patronizing coo. "Look, we know it's a lot of work for you. You're 62. Do you really want to be waking up at dawn to talk to distributors? We want to retire you. You can move to a condo in San Francisco." Something manageable. No stairs. I don't want a condo, I said, my voice shaking with a rage I was trying to suppress. And I am not retiring. I run this company. Well, Serena said, clicking a pen. That's actually the issue. We've noticed you've been slipping. Slipping? The wedding incident. Julian spoke up, finally looking at me. Mother. Wearing that dress. Creating that scene. It wasn't normal. Serena thinks and I agree that you're overwhelmed. You're making emotional decisions. Not rational ones. I didn't create the scene. Julian. You threw me out. Because you forced my hand. He shouted, slapping the table. The sound echoed violently. You always have to be the center of attention. You can't stand that I have a wife now. That I have someone else to listen to. You're obstructing our future. I am protecting your heritage. I countered. Julian. This woman sees dollar signs. I see 4 generations of blood and sweat. I am not turning this house into a hotel. Serena placed a hand on Julian's arm, a gesture of ownership. We need the keys. Eleanor. We need full access to the property to bring in the architects and the surveyors starting Monday. And we need you to sign the transfer of operational control. I reached up and touched the iron keys beneath my blouse. They were cold against my skin. No. Excuse me? Serena blinked, her smile faltering. No. This estate belongs to me. Arthur left it to me. The will states that upon my death, it passes to Julian. Until then, I am the executor, the owner, and the guardian. There will be no architects. There will be no spa. And Julian stood up. Dad left that land to me too. It's my birthright. He left you a trust and a minority share of the stock, Julian. But he left the control to me, because he knew that one day, you might be led astray by something shiny. I looked directly at Serena. We're not asking, Mother, Julian hissed. We're telling you. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to take steps. Legal steps. Is that a threat? It's a reality check, Serena said, closing her portfolio with a sharp snap. Competency hearings are messy, Eleanor. If we have to prove that you're unfit to manage the estate due to cognitive decline, well, nobody wants that on the public record. Just give us the keys. Go to the city. Enjoy your twilight years. I stood up. I was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of the adrenaline coursing through me. Get out of my house. It's my house too, Julian yelled. Not anymore, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than his shouting. Not until you remember who you are. Right now, I see a puppet. And I don't let puppets run this estate. They left in a fury of slamming doors and screeching tires. I watched them go. And then I went straight to the wall, safe behind the portrait of Arthur in the study. I opened it to check the documents, the deeds, the original incorporation papers, and a letter Arthur had written to me shortly before he died. He had been worried about Julian's soft heart. He feels too much, Elle. He's a good boy. But he's putty in the wrong hands. You have to be the kiln that hardens him, even if the fire hurts. I checked the papers. They were there. But something was wrong. The order was slightly off. A corner of the deed was folded. Someone had been in here. I remembered the dinner 2 weeks before the wedding, when Serena had excused herself to use the restroom and was gone for 20 minutes. She hadn't been fixing her makeup. The war had started long before the wedding. I realized then that I was fighting for my life. The next morning, I drove into town to see Mr. Abernathy, our family attorney. He was an old man, smelling of pipe tobacco and peppermint, who had buried my husband and baptized my son. When I told him what happened, he didn't look surprised. I've had inquiries, he said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. From a firm in the city, shark types. They were asking about the competency clauses in Arthur's trust. Can they do it? Can they declare me incompetent? They can try, Abernathy said. They would need testimony. They would need examples of erratic behavior. The wedding. They will spin that. They will say you are jealous, paranoid, unstable. If they get a judge to grant a temporary conservatorship, they can freeze your assets. They can lock you out of the bank accounts while the investigation is pending. In that time, they could dismantle the business. What do I do? You need to be bulletproof, he said. Go to a doctor. Today, get a full neurological workup. Get it on paper that you are sharp as a tack. And Eleanor, hide the original deed. Not in the house. If they get a court order for entry, they will raid that safe. I followed his instructions. I spent the day undergoing humiliating cognitive tests, reciting lists of words, drawing clocks. The doctor, a young woman who knew my reputation, signed the certificate with a flourish. You have the cognitive function of a 30-year-old, Mrs. Vance. I'll testify to that. I took the papers and the deed to a bank in the neighboring county and rented a safety deposit box. I locked my legacy away in a steel drawer. 2 weeks of silence followed. I worked the vines. I walked the rows of Cabernet grapes, touching the leaves, checking for pests. The physical labor grounded me. It reminded me that the land didn't care about lawsuits or greed. It only cared about the sun, the rain, and the hand that tended it. Then, the convoy arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I saw the dust cloud first. 2 black SUVs, and Julian's sports car. They parked in front of the main house. Julian got out, looking thinner, haggard. Serena emerged, looking triumphant. And with them were 2 men in suits, who looked like they charged by the minute. I met them on the porch. I didn't invite them in. Mrs. Vance, the taller lawyer began, extending a card. I represent your son and his wife. We are here to serve you with a petition for the partition of the estate. Partition? I looked at Julian. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Since the estate is a shared asset in the eventual inheritance, my client argues that your current mismanagement is devaluing his future interest. We are filing for a forced sale of the assets to liquidate his share immediately. Mismanagement? I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. Profits are up 12% this quarter. We have affidavits. The lawyer continued smoothly, stating that you are hostile to modernization, that you are turning away potential revenue streams, and that your personal vendetta against Mrs. Vance Serena is damaging the brand. We also have a motion for a competency evaluation. I have a medical certificate dated last week stating I am perfectly sane, I said, crossing my arms. Serena stepped forward. She placed a hand on her stomach. It's not just about business, Eleanor. It's about safety. For the baby, the world stopped spinning. The birds went silent. What? I whispered. I'm pregnant, Serena said, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. 3 months. You're going to be a grandmother. Julian wants his child to grow up with security. Not in a dusty old house, run by a bitter old woman who refuses to change with the times. I looked at Julian. He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with tears. It's true, Mom. A boy. We're having a boy. And you're using him as leverage? I asked, my voice trembling. You're using an unborn child to blackmail me out of my home? We're doing it for his future, Julian shouted, his voice cracking. We need the capital, Mom. We need to build something real, not just play farmers. Why do you have to be so selfish? You have the keys. You have everything. Just give us our share. Your share is this land, Julian. It's the dirt under your fingernails. If you sell it for condos, you sell your soul. I don't care about the dirt, he screamed. I care about my family, my wife, my son. You are the past, Mom. Just get out of the way, he extended his hand. Give me the keys. The lawyers need to inventory the wine cellar and the safe. I looked at the keys hanging around my neck. The iron felt heavier than ever. It felt like an anchor. I looked at Serena's triumphant face. I looked at the lawyers checking their watches. And I looked at my son, a man who was willing to burn down his history to warm his wife's ego. I reached up and unclasped the necklace. Julian's eyes widened. He thought he had won. He reached out, but I didn't hand them over. I put them in my pocket. No, I said. Eleanor, be reasonable, the lawyer warned. A court order will. Let the court order come, I said, my voice turning to steel. Let the judge decide. But hear this, Julian. If you sue me, if you drag this family through the mud of a public trial, you are not just suing a business partner. You are suing your mother. And there is no coming back from that. You're leaving us no choice, Serena said, her voice icy. Oh. I am giving you a choice, I said. You can walk away now, go home, and wait for the baby. We can talk like humans, or you can declare war. But if you declare war, you better be prepared to lose everything, because I fought droughts, floods, and banks to keep this place. Do you think a few lawyers and a manipulative girl are going to scare me? Serena's face twisted into a snarl. Let's go, Julian. We'll see her in court. We'll take it all. We'll leave her with nothing but that dress. Julian hesitated. He looked at the vines, then at me. For a second, I saw the boy who used to help me prune the roses. But then Serena touched his arm, whispered something, and the boy vanished. Goodbye, Mother, he said. They drove away. I stood alone on the porch, the wind whipping my hair. I felt a pain in my chest that was sharper than any heart attack. I had lost him. I had truly lost him. But I had work to do. The legal battle lasted 2 years. It was a war of attrition. They attacked my character, my spending habits, my mental health. They deposed my neighbors. They tried to freeze my accounts. I spent a fortune on defense. There were nights I sat in the dark house, wondering if I should just give up, sell the land, and let them have their resort. It would be easier. I could see my grandson. I could hold the baby. But then I would remember Arthur's letter. You are the kiln. If I gave in, I wouldn't be saving Julian. I would be enabling his destruction. I would be handing him over permanently to a woman who saw him as an ATM. So I fought. And I made a move they didn't see coming. I met with Mr. Abernathy, and we drafted a new estate plan. I created an irrevocable trust. I placed the entire Vance estate into the trust. The terms were specific. The land could never be sold for commercial development. It had to remain agricultural or be donated to the state of California as a historic park. Then came the poison pill. I stipulated that Julian would receive a generous income from the trust, but only if the estate remained intact. If he, or any spouse, attempted to contest the trust or sell the assets, his beneficiary status would be revoked immediately, and 100% of the assets would go to a charity for agricultural preservation. I signed it. It was ironclad. Even if I died tomorrow, they couldn't build their hotel. When the news of the trust reached their lawyers, the lawsuit stalled. There was no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow anymore. If they won, they got a farm they couldn't sell. If they lost, they paid legal fees. Then, the silence stretched into a 3rd year. My grandson, Leo, was born. I saw pictures of him on Instagram. He had Arthur's chin. I cried over my iPad, tracing his little face on the screen. But I didn't call. I couldn't. One rainy November evening, 3 years after the wedding, Mr. Abernathy came to the house. He didn't accept the tea I offered. Eleanor, he said softly. Julian and Serena are divorcing. I felt a shockwave hit me. What happened? The money ran out, Abernathy said. Or rather, the prospect of the money ran out. Once the trust was finalized, and the lawyers explained that the Vance Experiential Resort was legally impossible, Serena lost interest. She met someone else. A developer in Miami. Someone with liquidity. She filed last week. She's taking full custody of Leo. And Julian? He's in bad shape, Eleanor. He's living in a studio apartment in the city. He's bankrupt. The legal fees for the lawsuit against you. They drained his savings, and she took the rest. I sat there, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. I felt no triumph. There is no victory in watching your child suffer, even if he brought it upon himself. I just felt a profound, aching sadness. The prophecy had fulfilled itself. The land had been protected. But the family was shattered. I waited. I didn't call him. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. I wanted to rush to the city, pay his debts, bring him home, and make him soup. But I knew that if I saved him now, he would never learn. He had to find his own way back. He had to understand the weight of the keys. It took another 6 months. It was spring. The vines were just starting to bud. The bud break that signals the start of the season. I was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, weeding the lavender, when I heard the crunch of gravel. It wasn't a sports car. It was an old, battered sedan. I didn't stand up immediately. I waited. A car door closed. Footsteps approached. Slow and heavy. Mother? I stood up and brushed the dirt from my knees. I turned around. Julian stood there. He looked 10 years older. He had gray in his temples. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, not a suit. He looked tired, broken, and humble. Julian, I said. He didn't move. He stood 10 feet away, respecting the barrier he had built. He choked on the words. He took a deep breath. I was wrong. About everything. She never loved me. She loved the potential of me. She loved what she thought she could get from you. I know, I said. I lost it all, Mom. I lost my wife. I see Leo on weekends. But I missed his first steps because I was working double shifts to pay the lawyers to sue you. I was so stupid. He began to weep, standing there in the driveway. I betrayed you. I betrayed Dad. I walked over to him. I didn't say, I told you so. I didn't list his crimes. I simply opened my arms. He collapsed into me, sobbing like a child. He was a grown man, heavy and solid, but in that moment, he was just my boy. I held him while he shook, smelling the rain and the regret on him. You didn't lose everything. I whispered into his hair. You still have the dirt. We went inside. We drank coffee. We didn't talk about the lawsuit. We talked about the vines. He asked about the pH levels in the North Block. He asked about the harvest. Julian moved back into the cottage on the edge of the property. He didn't move into the main house. He said he hadn't earned it yet. He started working the fields. Starting from the bottom. Working alongside the crew. He pruned, he harvested, he drove the tractor. He learned to listen to the land again. It has been 5 years since the wedding. I am 67 now. My knees ache when it rains, and I move a little slower. But the estate is thriving. Julian is now the estate manager. He is a different man. He is quiet, thoughtful, and fierce in his protection of the land. He fights for sustainability, not profits. He understands now that we don't own the land. We just borrow it from our children. And Leo is 6. He comes every other weekend. He has his own little pair of boots. Yesterday, I watched from the porch as Julian taught Leo how to check a grape for ripeness. You have to taste the skin, Leo, Julian was saying. The sweetness is in the juice, but the character is in the skin. It's tough, but that's where the flavor comes from. I smiled. The lesson had been learned. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the iron keys. They were warm from my hand. I walked down the steps to where my son and grandson were standing. Julian, I called out. He turned, shading his eyes from the sun. I held out the keys. I think it's time, I said. He looked at the keys, then at me. He didn't grab them greedily like he had that night in the living room. He hesitated. Are you sure? He asked. I don't know if I'm ready. You are, I said. Because now you know what they open. They don't open a bank vault. They open a responsibility. He took them. His hand closed over the iron. He looked at the weight of them in his palm, tears shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. "Don't thank me," I said, turning back to the house. "Just keep the weeds out of the roses." I walked back up to the porch, feeling lighter than I had in years. Life is not about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go, and to whom. I had to be the villain in my son's story for a while, so that he could eventually become the hero of his own. It cost me years of loneliness. It cost me a broken heart. But looking at my son holding his son's hand among the vines that my husband planted, I knew the price was paid. Legacy isn't money. It isn't a building. Legacy is the values you leave behind when you are gone. And sometimes, to save the legacy, you have to be willing to lose the person you love most, just long enough for them to find themselves again. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am a mother, a widow, and a guardian. And finally, I am at peace.